The great hall of the Stonefall Palace was a sea of polished stone and shimmering silk, a place built for giants and filled with them. Tonight was the mating ceremony, the most important night of the year for the royal pack. The air itself buzzed with a nervous, wild energy, thick with the scent of pine ambition, and the perfumed oils the she-wolves used to make themselves irresistible. From high arched windows the moonlight poured in, painting silver stripes on the floor, but no one looked at the moon. Every single eye was fixed on the man sitting on the massive carved throne at the head of the hall. He was Ulric the Alpha King. He wasn't just sitting, he was holding court, a mountain of quiet power and simmering boredom. His frame was large, all hard muscle and broad shoulders that strained against the fine dark fabric of his tunic. His face was all sharp angles, a strong jaw that was currently clenched tight, and eyes the color of a stormy sky that scanned the line of young women with a look that was closer to exhaustion than interest. This was his duty to find a mate and secure his bloodline, but to him, it felt like picking a weapon from an armory. Each she-wolf presented was strong, beautiful, and fierce, their scents aggressive and demanding, each one screaming for his attention. He was so tired of it all. Far from all this glitter, deep in the warm, noisy underbelly of the palace, Freya was trying not to panic. The kitchens were a world of their own, a chaotic symphony of clattering pots, roaring fires, and the head cook's booming voice. Freya, a girl with hair the color of wheat and wide, anxious eyes, moved through the chaos like a ghost, careful not to be seen, careful not to be heard. She was a half-wolf, her father a human traveler who had long since vanished. Her mother, a low-ranking wolf, had passed away years ago, leaving Freya alone in a world that saw her as less. She was too human for the wolves, too wolf for the humans. Her scent was the proof, a faint, strange mix that was mostly just her. A soft, wildflower and rain scent that was utterly drowned out in the kitchen by the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread. Her job tonight was simple: help carry the final trays of honeyed cakes and moon-shaped pastries to the edge of the great hall. It was the closest she would ever get to a mating ceremony. She was not allowed to be seen by the nobles. She was not allowed to speak. She was just a pair of hands. Freya. The silver tray. Now, the head cook barked, his face red from the heat. Freya jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She carefully lifted the heavy silver tray, laden with delicate desserts that looked too beautiful to eat. It was immensely heavy, the weight making her arms tremble. She took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy wooden door that separated the kitchens from the main corridors, and stepped into the quiet, cool hallway. The difference was jarring. Out here, the sounds of the ceremony were a distant murmur, a low rumble of voices and the occasional formal announcement. The air was cooler, and the scent of the she-wolves from the hall drifted down the corridor, making her own half-wolf senses prickle with a strange sense of longing and exclusion. She walked carefully, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. She focused on the weight in her arms, on not stumbling, on being invisible. She reached the grand arched entrance to the great hall. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight. Hundreds of the pack's most important members were there, all dressed in their finest. Their combined power and presence felt like a physical wall. She saw the line of she-wolves waiting for their turn to be presented to the king, each one more stunning and confident than the last. And there he was, Ulric. Even from this distance he seemed to dominate the room, his presence a gravitational pull. Her task was to hand the tray to a steward who stood just inside the doorway. But the steward was not there. He had been called away to deal with some small crisis. Freya stood frozen in the doorway, holding the heavy, gleaming tray, unsure of what to do. The rules were clear: do not enter the hall. But the desserts needed to be served. Panic began to flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, peering into the crowd, searching for the missing steward. The tray was getting heavier, her arms beginning to shake with the strain. She took another step, her eyes scanning the blur of faces, and her foot caught on the edge of a thick, woven rug. Time seemed to slow down. She felt herself lurch forward, the tray tilting dangerously. A gasp escaped her lips. In a desperate, clumsy move, she twisted her body, managing to stop the tray from crashing to the floor, but the momentum sent her stumbling sideways. Her vision swam. She saw an empty chair, a beautifully carved wooden seat that was positioned on the raised dais, right beside the towering throne. It was the only empty seat in the entire hall. Without thinking, driven purely by the instinct to not collapse and spill the king's desserts all over the floor, she fell into it. The moment she landed, the air in the hall vanished. The murmuring stopped. The music that had been playing softly in a far corner died mid-note. The only sound was the frantic beating of Freya's own heart, which felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of her ribs. She had sat down. She had sat in the chair reserved for the potential future queen, right next to the Alpha King. A wave of cold horror washed over her. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her, feel the weight of their shock and their judgment. She was a kitchen girl, a half-breed, sitting in a place of honor. It was the most profound mistake of her life. Ulric had been watching another she-wolf approach, his expression one of polite disinterest, when the movement to his side caught his eye. He saw a flurry of motion, a girl with a tray, and then the unthinkable: she had sat in the empty chair. A hot flash of anger surged through him. Was this some new brazen tactic? A servant girl trying to catapult herself into his notice by causing a scene? His patience, already worn thin, snapped. He turned his head slowly, the movement deliberate and powerful. His stormy eyes narrowed, focusing on the girl who dared to invade his space. She was hunched over, trying to make herself small, her face pale with terror. She was clutching a silver tray of desserts as if it were a lifeline. She looked nothing like the proud she-wolves in the line. She looked ordinary and utterly petrified. He opened his mouth to summon the guards, to have this impertinent girl removed and disciplined, but as he leaned slightly closer, the words died in his throat. It was her scent. Cutting through the heavy, perfumed air of the ceremony, through the smells of food and wine and wood smoke, was the most delicate, unexpected fragrance. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't trying to demand anything. It was soft and clean, like wildflowers after a spring rain, with a faint, wild undertone that was uniquely wolf, yet different. It was a half-scent, an incomplete melody, and it was the most honest and calming thing he had smelled in years. It didn't claw at his senses, it soothed them. His anger evaporated, replaced by a deep, thrumming curiosity. Who was she? The silence in the hall was now deafening. Everyone was waiting for his reaction. Waiting for the explosion. He spoke, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the stone room, devoid of the anger he had felt moments before, but full of a king's command. "You girl." Freya flinched as if struck. Slowly, trembling so hard she was afraid she would drop the tray, she lifted her head to meet his gaze. His eyes were intense, searching but not cruel. What is your name?" he asked, the question simple but in this context earth-shattering. No one else had been asked their name tonight. Freya, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I work in the kitchens. I was bringing the desserts. I'm so sorry I tripped." A kitchen girl. A half-wolf. A ripple of disbelief, followed by quiet, mocking laughter, spread through the crowd. This was a joke. A clumsy servant had stumbled into the queen's chair. The king would surely laugh now and have her thrown out. But Ulric did not laugh. He didn't even smile. He just looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long, silent moment. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the humility, the complete lack of guile. She wasn't trying to trick him. She had just made a mistake. And that scent, it wrapped around him, a quiet peace in the middle of the noisy chaos of his duty. He could have ended it there. He could have nodded, told her to leave, and continued with the ceremony. But he found he didn't want to. This was different. This was real. He shifted his gaze from her terrified face to the steward who had finally appeared, looking horrified. "Take the tray," Ulric commanded, his voice firm. The steward scurried forward and carefully lifted the heavy silver tray from Freya's shaking hands. She was now left sitting there empty-handed, with no reason to be in the chair, exposed to the entire pack. Ulric turned back to the hall. He ignored the line of waiting she-wolves. He ignored the stunned faces of his advisors. His eyes swept over the crowd, and he spoke 3 words that sent a fresh shockwave through the room. "Let her stay." The silence in the great hall did not last. After the Alpha King's shocking command, a low, buzzing hum of whispers erupted, swirling around Freya like a swarm of angry bees. She felt each one as a physical sting. She sat frozen in the ornate chair, a statue of pure embarrassment, her cheeks burning with a heat that felt like it could melt stone. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare look at Ulric again. She simply stared at her own hands, clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The rest of the mating ceremony became a blur of noise and color that she couldn't focus on. The proud she-wolves were presented, one after another, but the king's attention felt distant, his responses short and formal. The air was thick with unasked questions, and all of them, Freya knew, were about her. Why was she still there? What was so special about a clumsy kitchen girl? When the ceremony was finally, mercifully over, Ulric stood without a word and left the hall through a private door, his advisors trailing behind him. The moment he was gone, the spell was broken. The crowd began to move and talk freely, and Freya seized her chance. She slipped from the chair, her legs feeling like wobbly jelly, and practically ran from the dais, keeping her head down and weaving through the dispersing crowd. She ignored the pointed fingers and the hissed comments she heard as she passed. "Half-breed, what a disgrace. Did you see her trip?" She didn't stop until the heavy kitchen door swung shut behind her, enclosing her in the familiar, loud, and blessedly anonymous chaos of her workplace. The head cook, a large man named Borin, simply stared at her, his mouth agape. The other kitchen servants stopped their cleaning to gawk. "Freya. By the moon, what happened out there? The whole palace is talking." Borin finally managed to say, his voice a mixture of concern and alarm. I sat in the wrong chair," Freya whispered, her voice trembling. "I tripped. And he told me to stay." Borin shook his head, his expression grim. "This is not good, girl. Not good at all. You've attracted the attention of the king. And you've made enemies of every high-born she-wolf in the palace. Mark my words, this will not end well for you." He shooed her away to scrub pots, a menial task usually given to the newest helpers, and Freya was grateful for it. The hot, soapy water and the repetitive, hard motion were a punishment she welcomed. It was real. It was normal. It grounded her after the surreal nightmare of the ceremony. For the next 2 days, Freya tried to become smaller than she ever had before. She did her work silently and efficiently, staying in the darkest corners of the kitchen, avoiding any place where she might be seen. But it was useless. The story had spread through the palace like a wildfire. Wherever she went, she felt the weight of stares. The other servants were either wary of her or openly hostile, afraid that her strange newfound notoriety would bring trouble on them all. She felt more alone than ever, a strange, marked creature in the only home she had ever known. On the evening of the second day, as she was sweeping the scullery floor, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up and her heart stopped. It was one of the king's personal guards, a mountain of a man clad in polished leather and steel. His eyes scanned the room and landed on her. "Freya?" he boomed. She could only nod, her grip on the broom handle turning her knuckles white. "His Majesty the Alpha King commands your presence. You are to walk with him in the royal gardens. Now." A cold dread washed over Freya. This was it. Borin had been right. She had attracted the king's attention, and now she was to be formally punished. Perhaps he had been merely saving face in front of the entire pack, and now, in private, he would banish her from the palace for her insolence. Or worse. With legs that felt like lead, she followed the guard out of the kitchens, not even daring to put her broom away. The royal gardens were a place of legendary beauty, a vast, manicured landscape of night-blooming flowers, shimmering reflecting pools and ancient, twisting trees. Under the light of the rising moon, it was a world of silver and shadow, utterly peaceful and terrifyingly intimate. And there, standing by a fountain, was Ulric. He was out of his formal court clothes, dressed in a simple, dark tunic and trousers. Without the throne and the crown and the crowd, he looked different. Still powerfully built and intimidating, but more like a man and less like a statue of a king. He dismissed the guard with a slight nod, and suddenly they were alone. Freya stood frozen a few feet away, her head bowed, waiting for the blow to fall. "You think I brought you here to punish you," Ulric said. His voice was quieter than it had been in the hall, less of a royal command and more of a simple observation. "Aren't you your Majesty?" Freya whispered to the ground. "No." The single word, spoken so plainly, made her risk a glance upward. He was watching her, his stormy eyes thoughtful in the moonlight. "Then why?" she asked, her courage flickering for a moment. "Because I was curious," he said, beginning to walk slowly along a gravel path that wound through a bed of glowing white flowers. After a moment's hesitation, she fell into step beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. "I spend my days surrounded by people who want something. Power. Influence. A title. They show me only what they think I want to see. And then you stumbled in, smelling of rain and looking at me like I was about to bite your head off. It was refreshing." He asked her about her life then, not as a king demanding a report, but with a genuine curiosity that slowly began to unwind the knot of fear in her chest. Haltingly at first, and then with more feeling, she told him. She spoke of her human father, a shadowy figure from stories her mother told, and of her wolf mother who died too young. She spoke of growing up in the shadows of the palace, never fitting in, always too slow, too clumsy, too human for the wolf pups, and too wild for the few human children in the servant quarters. She told him of her secret love for the healing herbs she grew in a cracked pot on her windowsill, and how she would sometimes sneak into the forest to just listen to the silence, a silence that didn't judge her. Ulric listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty sympathy. He just listened, and in the quiet attention of the most powerful man in the kingdom, Freya felt something she had never felt before, heard. When she finally finished, her story hanging in the air between them, he spoke again, his voice low. You feel you have no place. I understand that. A king's throne is the loneliest place in the kingdom. He looked up at the palace, its towers silhouetted against the starry sky. Everyone sees the crown. No one sees the man wearing it. They see a symbol. They don't see me. They bow, they obey, they scheme, but no one has simply talked to me in a very long time. Not like this. In that moment, Freya saw him not as the Alpha King but as Ulric. A man burdened by his crown, isolated by his power. The last of her fear melted away, replaced by a strange, warm feeling of connection. They walked further into the garden, the silence between them now comfortable, filled only with the chirping of crickets and the soft crunch of gravel under their feet. The path narrowed as it entered a grove of willow trees, their long trailing branches creating a private, shimmering curtain around them. As they moved to pass through a particularly narrow section, Ulric moved slightly ahead to hold a branch aside for her. As she passed him, her arm brushed against his. It was the briefest, most accidental contact. But the effect was electric. A jolt, warm and startling, shot up Freya's arm, spreading through her whole body. She gasped softly, stopping in her tracks. She looked up at Ulric, and saw her own shock reflected in his widened eyes. He had felt it too. It was more than a static shock. It was a spark of something deep and primal, a connection snapping into place. Without a word, Ulric slowly raised his hand. His gaze was intense, locked on hers. He gently, so gently, cupped her cheek. His hand was large and warm, his touch surprisingly soft against her skin. Freya's breath hitched. She should pull away. This was the king. But she found she couldn't move. His touch felt like coming home. Your scent, he murmured, his voice a husky whisper that vibrated in the quiet air. It's not just wildflowers. Honesty. It's peace. He leaned a little closer, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. When you are near, the noise in my head just stops. Freya's heart was pounding, but it was no longer from fear. It was from a wild, hopeful, terrifying feeling she couldn't name. She looked into his stormy eyes and saw not a king, but a man looking at a woman he truly saw. Ulric's hand fell from her cheek, but he didn't step back. The space between them was charged, alive with the unspoken thing that had just ignited. The night is still young, he said, his voice still low and intimate. I am not ready for you to go back to the kitchens yet. The days that followed the walk in the garden were a strange and surreal dream for Freya. She was still a kitchen servant, still sweeping floors and scrubbing pots, but everything had changed. The hostile whispers did not stop. If anything, they grew louder, sharper, more poisonous. But now, they were background noise, drowned out by the memory of Ulric's voice and the lingering warmth of his touch on her cheek. She carried a secret inside her, a small, glowing ember of happiness that the glares and muttered insults could not extinguish. She was summoned to walk with him again and then a third time. Each meeting was a stolen moment away from the watching eyes of the court. They talked of everything and nothing. He asked about her herbs and she, growing braver, asked him about his childhood, about the weight of the crown he had inherited too young. In the moonlit solitude of the gardens, they were not a king and a servant, but simply Ulric and Freya, two lonely souls who had found a quiet harbor in each other. But the real world, with its harsh rules and rigid hierarchies, was always waiting. The figurehead of the growing resentment was a she-wolf named Seraphina. She was everything Freya was not. Tall, magnificently strong, from a high-ranking family whose bloodline was almost as old as the king's own. She had been sure Ulric would choose her at the mating ceremony. Now she watched, her pride curdling into bitter jealousy, as the king spent his evenings with a half-breed who smelled of the earth and carried herself like a frightened deer. Seraphina and her friends made a point of being wherever Freya was, their comments designed to wound. Does the king enjoy your scent of soap and drudgery? One would sneer. Perhaps he pities you, another would mock. Even a king sometimes finds a stray puppy amusing for a little while. Freya did her best to ignore them, to focus on the memory of Ulric's eyes, so serious and intent when he listened to her. But the words seeped in, feeding the deep-seated insecurity that had been her lifelong companion. She was a half-wolf. She was weak. She could never stand beside a king, not in the way that truly mattered to a pack that valued strength above all else. The confrontation came on the morning of the full moon. Freya was fetching water from the well in the main courtyard when Seraphina and her circle deliberately surrounded her. "The little half-wolf," Seraphina purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Tell me, does the king know how to play with a fragile toy? Or are you kept on a shelf only to be looked at?" Freya clutched the water bucket, her heart hammering. "Leave me alone, Seraphina." "Oh, I cannot," Seraphina said, her smile vanishing. "You are an insult to every pure-blooded wolf in this pack. You sit with the king, you walk with him, and you have nothing to offer. No strength, no power, no noble blood. You are nothing." The words hit their mark. Tears pricked at Freya's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Seeing her weakness, Seraphina pressed her advantage. "The full moon is tonight. The pack will run. It is a time of power and wildness. I challenge you, half-breed. A simple test of strength. Let the pack see what the king is so fascinated by. Let them see you for what you truly are." A public challenge. It was a brutal, traditional way to settle disputes and establish dominance. To refuse was to admit cowardice and worthlessness. To accept was to face almost certain humiliation and injury. Freya's blood ran cold. She was no match for Seraphina. She opened her mouth, a refusal on her lips, but the look of triumphant contempt on Seraphina's face stole her voice. If she ran now, she would prove every ugly thing they said about her was true. She would prove herself unworthy of Ulric's attention. "I accept," Freya whispered, the words tasting like ash. The news spread faster than the previous gossip. By the time a royal guard found Freya, summoned to Ulric's private study, the entire palace was buzzing with the upcoming spectacle. She entered the room, a small, trembling figure before the large oak desk where Ulric sat. His expression was unreadable. "This challenge," he said, his voice flat. "You agreed?" "She left me no choice," Freya replied, her voice barely audible. "If I refused, I would have shown everyone I am the coward she says I am." Ulric stood and walked around the desk, coming to stand before her. He didn't look angry. He looked concerned. "Freya, Seraphina has trained for battle since she could walk. Her wolf is one of the largest and most aggressive in the pack. This is not a game." "I know," Freya said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "I know I cannot win. I am not strong like her." Ulric reached out and gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "You think being queen is about being the strongest fighter?" he asked softly. "I have spent my life surrounded by strong fighters. They are a dime a dozen. What you have, Freya, is much, much rarer." He cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. "You have a strong heart. Your strength is in your kindness. It is in your resilience, in the way you have survived a world that has given you every reason to be cruel. It is in the honesty of your scent. That is the strength a pack needs in its Luna. Not just the strength to break an enemy, but the strength to heal and to hold it together." His words were a balm, but the fear remained. "What do I do?" she pleaded. "You be yourself," he said firmly. "You do not have to fight her on her terms. You are faster than you think. You are smarter. You know this forest in a way she does not. You do not have to defeat her. You just have to show them all that you cannot be defeated." That night, under the massive, glowing orb of the full moon, the entire pack gathered in the sacred clearing at the edge of the forest. The air was thick with wild energy and anticipation. Wolves of all sizes paced, their coats shimmering in the silver light. Ulric stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression a mask of royal calm, but his eyes burned with a fierce, protective light as he watched Freya step forward. Seraphina was already there, a vision of predatory grace. With a confident smirk, she began her shift. Her body contorted, bones cracking and reforming, fur sprouting from her skin. In moments, a massive, sleek silver wolf stood where she had been, its lips pulled back in a snarl to reveal glistening fangs. It was a terrifying and powerful display. All eyes turned to Freya. Her shift was different. It was quieter, less violent, but no less complete. Her form shimmered, and where Seraphina's transformation was a roar, Freya's was a sigh. When it was done, a smaller, leaner wolf stood before the pack. Her coat was a mix of brown and gray, like the forest floor, and her eyes were the same warm, intelligent green as her human ones. She looked vulnerable next to Seraphina's magnificent beast. With a deafening roar, Seraphina charged. It was a direct, brutal attack meant to end the fight immediately. But Freya remembered Ulric's words. She did not stand her ground. At the last possible second, she darted sideways with a speed that surprised everyone, her lighter body allowing her to pivot easily. Seraphina's powerful jaws snapped shut on empty air. The large wolf skidded, confused, then turned and charged again. Again, Freya evaded, not with brute force but with agility, using her knowledge of the uneven ground, leaping over a fallen log that Seraphina simply plowed through. The pack watched, their initial jeers turning to murmurs of surprise. This was not the quick, humiliating defeat they had expected. Seraphina was growing more and more furious, her attacks becoming wilder, less controlled. She was using all her strength while Freya was using her wits. During one frantic chase, Seraphina lunged, her claws raking across Freya's flank. Freya yelped in pain, stumbling, and a young, overly excited wolf pup who had gotten too close to the action was knocked aside by Seraphina's thrashing tail, yelping as it hit a rock. Seeing the hurt pup, something shifted in Freya. This was no longer about her pride or her fear. This was about protecting someone weaker. Ignoring the searing pain in her side, she didn't turn to face Seraphina. Instead she moved. In a flash of brown and gray, she placed herself between the snarling Seraphina and the cowering pup, baring her own teeth in a silent, fierce snarl of protection. She stood her ground, not to attack but to defend. It was in that moment that Ulric moved. His shift was not like the others. It was an explosion of power, a blur of motion and a sound of tearing fabric. In the space of a single heartbeat, where the king had stood, was an enormous jet-black wolf, larger than any other in the clearing. His presence was an avalanche of pure alpha power that made every wolf, including Seraphina, lower their heads and whimper in submission. He did not look at Seraphina. He paced, slow and deliberate, straight towards Freya. The great black wolf, a creature of legend and fear, walked up to the smaller, wounded she-wolf who was still guarding the pup. He stopped before her. The entire pack held its breath, expecting him to reprimand her for her display. Instead, the mighty Alpha King, Ulric in his most powerful form, lowered his great head. He gently, tenderly nuzzled her wounded flank. Then he nuzzled her face, a gesture of deep affection and profound respect. He then turned his head to the sky, his chest swelling, and let out a long, mighty, earth-shaking howl. It was not a howl of battle or anger. It was a king's howl, a royal declaration that echoed through the mountains. It was the sound of a choice made, a mate claimed. One by one, hesitantly at first and then with growing conviction, the members of the pack joined the howl. Their voices rose in a united chorus, no longer in mockery but in acceptance. They howled for their king, and they howled for the brave, kind-hearted she-wolf who had shown them that true strength was not in the sharpness of your claws, but in the courage of your heart. Later, back in their human forms, under the witness of the moon and his entire pack, Ulric took Freya's hands in his. The clearing was quiet now, filled with a new, respectful silence. "Freya," Ulric said, his voice strong and clear for all to hear. "You have shown more strength and more nobility today than any wolf I have ever known. You are my equal in every way that matters. Will you do me the greatest honor? Will you be my queen? My Luna? My mate for all our days?" Freya looked at him, at the man who saw her, who valued her, who loved her for exactly who she was. The ember of happiness in her chest burst into a brilliant, unwavering flame. "Yes, Ulric," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I will." And as he leaned in to kiss her, a deep, loving kiss that sealed their promise under the full moon, Freya knew she had finally truly come home. If you were swept away by the love story of Ulric and Freya, and want to journey with us through more tales of forbidden romance, fierce loyalty, and hearts that find their home against all odds, be sure to subscribe. Their story may be complete, but many more are waiting to be told.